everyone. My name is Susy Schöneberg. I'm Flexport's Director of Solutions, and I'm very excited to welcome you to Flexport Carbon webinar. In today's webinar, I will talk about why carbon emissions matter, how you can measure your carbon footprint, how you can reduce your emissions, and what you can do about the emissions that you can't avoid. So why are we talking about carbon emissions today? Carbon dioxide is accounting for over 90% of all greenhouse gas emissions. As you might know, CO2 is trapping energy in the atmosphere, which is causing more severe and more frequent weather phenomena. Transportation is the second largest source of CO2 emissions. We know that we have to reduce CO2 emissions in order to mitigate and reduce the effects of global warming. And experts stated that technology will be one of the major levers in order to do so. Let's take a closer look regarding logistics. Logistics is accounting for 30% of all transport-related CO2 emissions. This amount is equal to the emissions of a country like Germany. When we look to the different modes, trucking is accounting for 57% of all those emissions. In the US alone, more than 70% of all goods are transported by truck. Ocean freight is accounting for 17%, whereas air is accounting for 10%. These numbers do not only matter to you because of your supply chain and the composition of your supply chain, but also because many countries like China, the European Union, and even states in the US have issued mandates regarding emissions. They stated clear goals for emission reductions and sometimes even ask companies to report on their carbon emissions. When we look in the future, you might be familiar with the fact that actually global energy consumption is dropping. However, for freight, the energy consumption remains stable in the OECD countries or is even increasing in non-OECD countries. Overall, estimates say that freight emissions are expected to increase by 4x by 2050. So there is still a lot of work to do. Now I would like to talk about measurement. Before we go into the details of carbon emission measurement, I would like to point out that it's very important that you decide first which approach you're taking before you're starting the exercise. According to the Global Greenhouse Protocol, there are like different scopes of carbon emissions. Scope 1 is all your direct emissions, for example, caused in your factory by burning fuel. Scope 2 are all indirect emissions, for example, from electricity. And Scope 3 are all other indirect emissions. It's always the company's discretion to decide what is your responsibility. It can be either ownership, it can be operational control. So it depends on you as a company if you consider actually freight to be part of your control and in part of your scopes of your emissions. What we have seen from companies that have CSR reports or report according to ESG criteria is that many of them consider transportation to be essential to their operations and that they take responsibility for those emissions. If we talk about emissions from your supply chain, we usually focus on emissions that are caused by burning fossil fuels, be it via air freight, ocean freight, trucking, port terminal operations, warehousing, and all other kind of related operations. In general, there are two different methods that you can rely on. If you own the assets, so let's say you have your own truck fleet, it's actually pretty simple. You can rely on your fuel consumption as kind of the main indicator, and what you would do is you would take all your fuel consumption and then multiply this by the fuel emission factor. However, for most companies, this is not the case. They're working with carriers directly, they use freight forwarders and other third parties in order to organize their supply chain. And now, suddenly, it's getting way more complicated to actually calculate your emissions. The basic, simple methodology in order to really get the transparency about your carbon emissions is you could take the number of your shipments, multiply this by the distance that the goods were transported, the weight of the goods, and then a simple or basic mode emission factor. However, it's really, really hard to actually get all the variables that you need. What we recommend in order to assess your emissions is to think about the modes of transportation. Is it air, ocean, trucking, or rail? The route of your shipment? What is the mileage? Are there stops along the way? What about waiting time in the port? The fuel efficiency of the different vehicles or vessels? The utilization of the container and vessel? Cargo dimensions such as weight, volume, packaging, pallets and carton counts, and the cargo type. So for example, if you ship goods that need to be refrigerated, way more energy will be consumed. As you might have seen by now, it's very hard actually to get this information. So the first challenge, the basic challenge that we see is that there are different methodologies actually for calculating those emissions. And oftentimes it might not be clear to you which method the carrier is using that you're getting the data from, or which method the calculator that you can find online is really using. Also, oftentimes companies have only aggregated transportation data instead of data on a shipment level, which means you don't really know how much is transported by air versus ocean. You don't really know what is the average weight. So even if you take average data and you say, okay, on average, my shipment weighs, let's say, 11,000 kilos, it's pretty obvious that probably the shipment that you transport by air will have less weight than your usual shipment by ocean. So just like working with these aggregated data is really hard, a usual kind of unit that we use is ton miles. So you could, basically it's transporting a good, 1 ton of good, 1 mile. But it actually matters which shipment was how heavy and how far you transported it. You can't just take the aggregated numbers and multiply them, then you will be way off. So getting this really shipment level data is a huge challenge that we see. Also, you might see that a lot of numbers that are published are actually historical emission factors. But if a company is getting in your fleet, for example, an ocean carrier is getting in your ship, this emission factor can be different for your actual year of shipment. The routings can be different, if there are, for example, natural disasters, or if a certain shipping route is closed. So actually relying on data, on past data, might not really reflect your shipments of this given year that you're actually looking at. And the last point I would like to highlight as a challenge for measuring carbon emissions is full transparency in your supply chain. Many carriers belong to the Clean Cargo Working Group. It's a group where they commit to make their emission factors available per lanes, which is great. 80% of the carriers belong to this group. However, even if you're booking with a certain, let's say, ocean carrier line, actually your freight might move on a different vessel, because oftentimes these companies work in alliances. That means they decide, okay, together we will serve this route from, let's say, Shanghai to Los Angeles. I will give 3 ships, my partner is giving 3 ships, and then, for each different day, one of us is providing a ship. And you as a client might not even know on which vessel your cargo is really moving. And the engine efficiency might be completely different. The capacity of the vessel might be different. So really having this full transparency affects the emissions tremendously. At Flexport, we developed our own calculator. That was one of my major projects over the past month, half a year. And so what we focus on is to provide an analysis for each leg of the shipment that is mode specific, that is taking into account the distance, the vessel efficiency, the detailed shipment dimensions, and we also estimate the utilization. What we offer to our clients is to view the tonnage that is caused by a specific shipment in the app and also in the general analytics dashboard, which I will show in a minute. Our calculator is part of our app, which means anytime the cargo dimensions change, a route is getting updated, maybe a stop has to be added, we will capture all this real-time information and update the calculation of the emissions. This calculator was designed specifically with those limitations that I was describing before in mind. Of course, it's a continuous development. We always take the feedback from our stakeholders to make those information even better. But we really think that big data can help a lot to make those calculations even more efficient. Here's just like a quick snapshot from our analytics tool. Our clients are able to analyze their emissions by mode, by product type, by supplier, over the timeline to really get this transparency, which is like, the fundamental first step to really assess your carbon emissions. Now let's talk about reduction. What are you doing if you actually know how big the problem is? First of all, I would like to talk about what the freight world in general is doing to reduce carbon emissions. What we've seen in the past is that many terminals and ports are actually getting more and more sustainable. Ports are getting automated, so you can reduce the idle time of ships, so they're not staying in the port with their engine running. There are many clean trucks programs where ports actually request that trucks are getting updated regularly, and there's more and more electrification of the operations. In addition, as I just mentioned, there are more and more standards worldwide for trucks to reduce the emissions. You have seen earlier that over 50% is actually caused by road transport emissions. There are the first companies in the US that actually use LNG as a fuel for cargo ships, which means that the emissions get reduced by 25%, and also railways get more and more electrified. But what can you do actually to control your emissions? On the right-hand side, we can see a comparison of the emissions per ton mile for the different modes. Air freight is by far the most kind of emission-heavy transportation mode, whereas like ocean freight, just given that there's so many containers on one ocean ship, is the most efficient one. So we would recommend to really analyze your supply chain with the different kind of tools that we provide, or like by doing your own analytics to see, can you use ocean freight instead of air freight? Can you use rail instead of truck? Can you reduce the stops? Especially for like short-haul air freight, the emission kind of factors are really, really high. So is it possible for you to use an express service or a direct instead of a deferred service? If you have to use deferred services, if you're flexible or like for price reasons, which is totally understandable, we would encourage you to think about utilization. Can you use your warehouse or the warehouse of your logistics provider in order to consolidate your goods and ship FCL and LTL instead of LCL shipments? And the last step is thinking about your inventory. Can you achieve more flexibility regarding your arrival dates? Send, as I mentioned before, like the consolidation piece, one large shipment instead of smaller ones. Are you able to get in at night so that you can, for example, avoid congestion that's happening over the day, which is oftentimes causing long waiting times for trucks? So there are many different levers that you actually have the control of, and where your logistics provider can advise you on to really optimize your logistics, not only for transit time and price, but also for cargo, for CO2 emissions. And just to summarize again, we really think that data is the key to really reduce cargo emissions. There are many resources out there. There's not only our carbon calculator, which is showing the emissions for free for every shipment, but there are also other websites. We mentioned a few here to really think about kind of your shipping method and how you can increase efficiency. And we also saw a lot of success from companies that actually set a specific reduction goal. For the last part of my presentation, I would like to talk about compensation and how you can actually offset your carbon emissions. In general, what are carbon offsets? Carbon offsets are investments in carbon reducing programs that help you to actually cut the carbon proportionally to the amount that your shipment would emit. We as Flexport have a close partnership with carbonfund.org Foundation, a foundation that has been doing this for more than 10 years, and they offer several projects. We listed the few that Flexport is supporting in order to offset the emissions. If we think about the cost, I often get asked, what are actually the costs for offsetting? Of course, this depends on the mode and on the profile of your specific supply chain, but on average, it's roughly 1% of the shipping costs. This was my short introduction into carbon emissions, how to measure them, how to reduce them, and how to offset them. Now I would like to open it for questions. And I would also like to take a moment to introduce our special guest to you. It's not only me answering your questions. I have also Angela Liu with me. She's one of our operations experts. And I'm very, very excited that Jared Emmert from carbonfund.org joined us. He's the Global Project and Investments Manager, who can answer all the questions regarding offsets. Okay, so one question that I'm seeing is, what activities are increasing the freight emissions by 4x? So maybe I'm going back to the slide.
Sure. This is Angela speaking. I can jump in on this one. This figure was a projected figure by the International Transport Forum's International Freight Model due to the projected high growth of trade. The ease and accessibility and affordability of shipping, as well as the larger number of trade agreements, is projected to increase the number of the amount of air freight, as well as shipping in general. And the growth of trade in non-OECD countries, as shown in a previous slide, is also going to lead to increased freight emissions. In addition, the growth of production and consumption centers will also contribute to this growth.
And for example, if we look at different trade lanes, intra-Asia is one of the fast-growing trade lanes. And as we have shown here, trucking is causing the bulk of the emissions. And so if you think about intra-Asia trade and kind of the modes that they're using, this is kind of the main driver for freight-related emissions. Yeah, and the question, there was just a feedback to repeat the question that was asked. We just talked about why are freight emissions increasing by 4x in the future? What is the reason? Oh, there was a question regarding sharing the deck and how to communicate to clients. We would definitely be able to share the deck. We are also happy to share more information about our calculator, about other calculators, so we're really open for questions. Please feel free to reach out either to me, it's susy@flexport.com, susy@flexport.com, or any of your account executives. Really happy to provide general information. Also, at the end of the presentation, we have links to further kind of resources for you that provide more information. Also, the recording will be available. That was another question. We will provide this as well. And then a question about how to communicate this to clients. That's a very good one. What we've seen is that the stakeholders, not only governments, but even like consumers and clients, ask about carbon emissions, what we try to do is really to break it down kind of easily to show you, okay, what are your emissions, and then make it really easy with working with Carbon Fund to offset your emissions so that you technically could provide carbon-free shipping.
All right, we have a question about the future for electric vehicles, as well as another question regarding LNG and alternative energy sources. So as we said earlier, a lot of countries and municipalities are already issuing mandates long ago about emissions reductions and disclosures by companies. Already in the US, EU, and China, there are heavy-duty trucking standards that are coming out. The EPA in 2016 released the final rulemaking for heavy-duty vehicle fuel efficiency and greenhouse gas standards. Definitely the future of electrification is something that Flexport and our partners highly encourage. We're thinking toward the future in reducing the amount of emissions through electrification, and electrical vehicles will definitely play a large role in that.
And what we expect, maybe to be more specific regarding electric trucks, is probably the first trials will be in ports. It's very easy to guide them in ports where it's more complicated really to do the end-to-end to the warehouse. So probably port operations could be the first pilots that we're seeing. I saw another question regarding the limited range of e-vehicles. That's definitely another reason for why we expect them to kind of get deployed in ports first, because the distances are way shorter than doing like the long haul with electric vehicles and trucks. I think another reason why we expect freight emissions to go up is because we don't expect a kind of national or worldwide deployment of heavy-duty electric vehicles. So there's another question, is this just informal, or are these measures integrated in pricing and offset it already? So in this case, I can only speak for Flexport, but I've also been working at DB Schenker and other freight forwarders. So what we see usually is that this is not included in the pricing already. What we do at Flexport is providing you the visibility about your emissions per shipment. We didn't offset the pricing, or we don't offset automatically. It really depends on the clients if they want to offset or not. However, what we do as a company is to mimic the efforts. So we assess our office emissions and business travel emissions and account for those emissions that can't be, or that clients are not responsible for, to be a sustainable company ourselves. However, we don't force clients to offset. The next question is, how do you leverage some port with eco-friendly equipments like onshore energy to attract customers to call these ports instead of others? Again, we believe that our customers should have the choice where they want to go. If we have a client that wants to use those ports and terminals, we know which carriers are calling specific terminals and what the initiatives of the companies are. So for example, in LA and Long Beach, there are several initiatives that we know about, and we also know which kind of carriers commit to certain carbon emission goals. So we can advise our clients specifically and make sure that the routing and even like the shipment schedule that we're advising is aligned with their emission goals. Right now, it's not automatically available in the app. So right now, you can't basically choose, I want to have the most CO-friendly kind of routing, but our operations experts have the knowledge and can advise you accordingly. The percentage of clients heavily depends on the segment. So what we've seen is that, the question is, what percentage of clients typically opt to offset, and how does Flexport incentivize? We've seen that this heavily depends on the region. So oftentimes clients that either are located in the European Union or sell in Europe are, based on the reporting requirements, more incentivized to really measure and also disclose their CO2 emissions. Larger companies as well. So oftentimes if you check the websites and the sustainability programs of larger accounts, they have a very dedicated sustainability goal set that we try to support, not only with carbon emissions, but also with our Flexport.org initiatives, providing discounted shipments for NGOs and things like that. And how do we incentivize? I think it's based on our partnership with Carbon Fund, the amount of consulting that you get from Carbon Fund, the support, and the rate, because we are kind of consolidating the emissions, we are also able to issue certificates and can provide updates regarding our projects. What I would like to emphasize regarding carbonfund.org Foundation, all the projects are internationally certified. They're also additional, so you can be sure that basically the money that is passed on to Carbon Fund is really used to offset the carbon that was caused by the shipments. Yeah. There's another question regarding China. Is China aligning with the sustainability goals from the shipping industry, such as the ones you're supporting? So in general, this is a very broad question regarding China and their motives to think about sustainability and even like using e-vehicles. Flexport recently published a blog post about the factory closures in China. One of the major drivers is the environmental situation and kind of the pollution that is taking a toll on the people living there and the general environment. So this is one of the main drivers. China committed officially to goals that they're like pursuing. However, if we look in the kind of operations, oftentimes it's European or like American companies where most of the innovation is happening regarding like engine efficiency. However, China has introduced low emission zones in I think 20 major cities where they really want to reduce the emissions that is caused by trucking, for example. And officially, green freight was identified as a top priority, but it's something that is for us hard to control. So the 30 minutes are already over. Thank you so much for joining. It's a topic, that I could talk about for way longer. So again, feel free to reach out to check the resources that we provide, or contact our partners at Carbon Fund. Thanks to Jared again for joining us today. Let us know if there are other questions. And I would like to introduce the next webinar to you. The next webinar will be on November 14th, and Travis will talk about dangerous goods.